Well, I'm also going to talk about education, but in a somewhat different context, which is you might have you might notice when talking about your children or your grandchildren, we are a little worried about the internet and what they're doing with it. The little devices that they seem to be constantly on, and we make the safe assumption that whatever it is that they're doing on it must be terrible, and therefore we should tell them not to. So I sort of bumped into all this quite accidentally many years ago, many decades ago, in a completely different context. And I was living in India at that time. It was the time when computers were very expensive. And nobody ever thought that children should have anything to do with computers because, you know, they're complicated technological devices. At that time, the few people who did have computers at home kept reporting that their children, little children as little as 6 or 7, were actually doing things on the computer which they did not expect them to be able to do, and they said, we don't know how they're doing that. So I got a little curious about this and thought that this needs to be investigated a bit further. Is it that the children of these rich people who have the computers, they're very clever, or could it be that all children have this ability to do things on this particular kind of device? So I did an experiment, and which was really simple, which was to take a computer and put it literally out in the street in New Delhi, in a slum. You can't sort of put it in the street, so I buried it into a wall, and the experiment got called the hole in the wall. And it had the internet running on it, and I just put it there, and people thought it was not a good idea. Because in those days, they said, you know, are you trying to say that if you put a helicopter over there, the children are going to just fly it? They're only going to kill themselves. So, but you can't do that with a computer. So I said, well, they're not going to kill themselves with a computer. Let's just see what they do. And to cut the very long story short, within 2 days, it was out in all the newspapers saying that there's this guy in New Delhi. No, it said, we found street children in New Delhi surfing the internet in English, which they don't know, and doing all sorts of things like downloading games and installing them onto the computer. And there's this guy in Delhi who says that all this happened by itself. It was considered completely fabricated. They said, he must have taught them. Somebody must have taught them. Anyway, the World Bank got interested, and they said, you know, if this is even remotely true, then you've got something here which is really important for training. Because look at the amount of money we spend in teachers and things to teach people how to do these things. So can you either prove or disprove yourself? So I did a long experiment with that money I got from the World Bank. And I was able to show, took about 3 years' time, that groups of children given internet access on a big screen. These are all important factors. They must be in groups, the screen must be big, do actually get to learn all about it by themselves in a very short time, in a matter of months. In fact, the actual numbers are that groups of children given access to the internet on a safe big screen would, in 9 months, reach the same level of proficiency as an average office secretary in the West, which again was considered very absurd. But then I said, well, here are the measurements, and this is what it shows. And it was working everywhere. By then, people had tried it in Cambodia, people had tried it in South Africa. Anyway, so it's something that I think we all know now. You know that if you have a child of 4 and give him an iPad or give her an iPad, they start doing things with it. It's well known now, but it wasn't known then. So that was the first bit. And I published the results, and I said, you know, children can learn to use these digital devices by themselves. That's it. The question, of course, was that what would they do with it once they have? I mean, basically, people said, well, so what? So I brought those results here to Gateshead. I work at the university, at Newcastle University, and I brought them to Gateshead because of one particular primary school teacher, Emma, who came and visited me and said, you know, just come to our school and show us if this sort of thing works over here. By then it was 2006, but it still wasn't very evident that that the children would be able to use everything in a computer. So I went to her school and I demonstrated to her very quickly, simply by taking a few 9-year-olds. It's a school called St. Aidan's in Derwentwater Road. I just took a group of 9-year-olds and I gave them a computer. I mean, they already had lots of computers, so I said, you shut all the computers down except one. And now take that computer and I'd ask them a question. It could be anything. I could ask them something like, is it going to rain in London tomorrow? And then, as you might expect, 2 minutes later, they say, yeah, it's going to, and this is the probability that it will. And so Emma said, okay, it's a big deal. So I said, okay, let's push it a little further. So we took a school examination question from GCSE, and these were 9-year-old children. And I said, you know, you're never going to be able to do this. This is a good way to start with children. If you say that, then they usually try very hard. I said, I'm sure you're never going to be able to do this, but this is a question meant for much older children. Can you use your computer to figure it out? They, of course, wanted to know, can't we use all the computers? And I said, no, there's a big story for that. And I told them the Indian story. And I said, you know, if you have too many computers, it doesn't work. You have to have a few so that you talk to each other. They solved that. Then we did a whole series of experiments. And we took them to GCSE A-level questions, the 9-year-olds of Gateshead. And they would solve them quite easily. So the second part of the answer, the first part was children can use a computer, raising the question, so what? The second part, they can teach themselves things. Things which are normally taught by teachers. I published that, and it's actually quite popular on the internet. It's called the Gateshead experiments. And it showed that this is sustainable, repeatable. So naturally, teachers everywhere got interested, and the results started to spread throughout England, and then, to my delight, everywhere. Simply because teachers thought that this is very easy. Instead of my going on and on lecturing, I make a question which is interesting. I give them the internet, and they'll figure it out. So thousands and thousands of schools started to use it everywhere. I started getting called to conferences to speak about it, first within England, then everywhere. First to conferences, and then it changed, and I found this very interesting. It changed to invitations from groups of schools. So the conference was about the theoretical bit. So what did you find? What experiments did you do? When the schools called, they said, come and show us. Do it with our children. So I did, well, they were fascinating experiments for me. Conducting a session like the ones I did in Gateshead, but with children who speak only Spanish in Chile. And I was able to show the teachers that even without knowing the language, I can do this, because all I'm doing is asking them a question. If I don't even know the language in which to ask the question, well, I type it into Google Translate, and whatever comes out, I give it to them. And they give me the answer back. So it went everywhere. Then came the third objection. The first, remember, was they will never be able to learn the computer by themselves. The second, so what if they can? The third, they can never answer difficult questions by themselves, you know, academic questions. The answer, no, they can. Then came the question, but it's not real learning. So now I was stuck. I thought, well, could you tell me what really knowing means? And I found to my surprise that no one could describe to me what really knowing means. But they could tell me that it's not really knowing. So I said, well, that's a very strange problem. How do I solve that? So I'm still at it. Uh, but, but in the meanwhile, the invitation started changing again. And it changed from groups of schools to governments. And I thought, well, now I'm a bit like a fish out of water. I don't really understand how to talk to governments. And there would be secretaries and undersecretaries of governments from different countries about whose education system or policies I don't really know much. So I would just go and tell them the experiments. And I did this, and I did this. Here's the publication. Here's another one. And they said, are you trying to say that we don't need to teach? So I said, no, that's not what I'm trying to say. I'm just trying to say you don't need to tell children things anymore. You can ask them things, and they can tell you back, okay? Because they have the internet. We didn't have it. So that's really the story as it is right now. This strange objection about what does really know mean. And I'm trying to figure that out. In the meanwhile, the last government to call me, surprise, surprise, was the British government. So I have something interesting to tell you, that on Tuesday I'm speaking at the House of Commons, and there are MPs present there. Finally, after 14 years of the Gateshead experiments, they want to know, well, we understand you did something up there in the north. So, what exactly is it? Something like that. So I hope it'll get somewhere. So I'm going to tell, so basically what I'm going to now, what I tell the governments now are what changes do we need in the system? Let me put it this way. First of all, we have an education system. It's a very powerful, a strong education system developed over hundreds of years, and an extremely successful one. Because look at the innovations that have come, for example, out of this part of the country. So we can't just say that that education system doesn't work. It works very well. The problem is that it's a little out of date. And I'm sure that the people who created that system, if they were to see their system in use today, would have said, what on earth are you doing? I mean, don't you think you need to modernize it? I'll give you some examples. We use the internet 24/7. We have little mobile phones, this, that, and anything you want to find. If you take an application like messaging, WhatsApp, lots of people use it. If I ask them, do you know how it works? Do you know what happens when you type your message into this phone and it gets to that phone? Where does it go and how does it travel? And I find that most people are very tentative about the answer or simply don't know it. But the same person, if I were to say, do you have some idea about how a steam engine works? Would say yes. Now that's the problem. If you look at the examination questions, those questions are about, at what speed should a cannonball be launched at an angle of 37 degrees so that it goes 3 miles and lands on its target? Okay. I don't know how useful that is, So, but a question like, what happens when an email is sent from here to Hong Kong is not asked because the teachers don't know the answer. So the first suggestion that I'm making is that the internet should be introduced as a subject in school. Instead of saying we are very scared and we're going to keep it away, we should do the opposite. If we think it's dangerous, and if we think that the children are going to be exposed to it anyway, then it must be brought into school so that we can show them what the dangers are or whatever. So that's the first point. The second, but having said that, you cannot teach the internet because it changes too fast. It changes every day. So I'm in luck because I can now say if you accept the fact that the internet should be a subject, then you must accept the fact that the children must learn it by themselves. There's no other way. So we should ask them, do you use YouTube? Yes, you do. Well, I'll give you 45 minutes. Tell all the teachers how exactly YouTube works. We can't figure it out. We're too old. we can figure out steam engines. so, so children love it, as you might imagine. You know, I mean, they simply love it, and they go back home and say, you know, SUGATA came. He's a professor at Newcastle University, doesn't know anything, and we have to explain everything to them, etc. So why not? I mean, it's a powerful method. The second suggestion: take the curriculum and divide it into 3 parts. The 3 parts are as follows. The first part are things which you need to live with, which are valuable lessons for life that your child is going to need. Well, that's kind of obvious. So, you know, from starting with how do you cross the road to going on to other things. But if you try to make a list of what the child needs today, you'll find that that list is actually changed a lot over the last 30, 40, 50 years, and that the list that we have in school is actually from another time. It doesn't really apply, you know. So we need to revise that. So that's my second suggestion, to make one part of the curriculum the life skills of today. One of the biggest would be how to search on the internet for things and how to make sure that what you found is correct. Okay, instead of saying the internet is full of junk. It is not, actually. It's got as much junk as any library does. You need to know how to find the junk and leave it out. The second part of the curriculum are things that are good to know. Makes you feel good to know them. For example, particularly for children, crabs can smell with their feet. I mean, you might say, well, how is it going to help me live the rest of my life? It won't, but it's a nice thing to know. Okay? So we make this second lot, because otherwise, if I say only teach those skills which will help you live, then you're going to leave out stuff like the solar system, galaxies. Surely you can't do that we need to know those things as well. And that leaves, so we have the second part, but the 2 parts have to be treated differently. The first part, the skills that you need to live with, must be done through instruction, practice, until we are absolutely sure that everybody's got it. The second part, things that are great to know, should be through stories, through fiction, through other media, television, whatever, because they're good to know. We need a judicious mix of the 2. And then there's a third part, unfortunately. The part that might come in the exam. So you have to take the old questions from the exams and then say, last year these were the questions. Often those things that come in the exam have little relationship with these other 2 parts. So if we did that, I think we would de-stress the children a lot. We could tell them, this is the real stuff, the thing you need for life. This is the good, fun stuff. And this is the exam stuff. You have to memorize that. Obviously, no government likes hearing that. So I have to say that, therefore, you have to get rid of that third bit, which means you have to do something to the exam. So the first suggestion was bring the internet as a subject, how it works, the technology of the internet. Second suggestion, break the curriculum into these 3 bits and remove the third bit. The third part, how do we do that, is perhaps the hardest to implement, the hardest to decide to implement, and the easiest to do, which is allow the use of the internet during exams. And people are absolutely aghast at the idea. You know, in one meeting with school teachers down south in London, one of the teachers, I said, you know, the internet, we should allow them the use of the devices during exams, and one teacher said, but they'll answer everything. So I said, well, don't we want them to? You know? And that's when they said, but they don't really know. So I don't know, I mean, maybe we should discuss this whole thing about really knowing stuff and how useful that is if you have your device. Anyhow, imagine if the internet was allowed during an exam. According to me, it's just an administrative, a bureaucratic decision. It takes only 1 line of text to do that and a signature. Do you realize that it would change the entire system? Because if you're a teacher, now you're going to go into class and say, you know, you can use your smartphone in the exam, so better know how to use that properly, better have the batteries charged, and better be sure you know how to ask questions quickly enough and get the answers, better know how to figure out what's the right answer and what's not, etc. Imagine the person who's making the examination questions. There's no point making a question which Google can answer in 2 seconds. What's the point? But you can make questions which you cannot answer using the internet, and certainly not in 5 minutes. We call them big questions. I'll give you an example, and that's what I do with children now, and they find it very entertaining and interesting. For example, I would ask children, do you cry? So of course, everybody cries. So what happens? Oh, we cry when we're sad. And what happens then? You get tears coming out of your eyes. That's really odd. So what does unhappiness have to do with salt water falling out of your eyes? So they were, well, and that's what it is. So I said, if I give you some time, can you figure out why on earth are we designed so that when we feel sad, we start producing salt water out of our eyes? I mean, we could have done 20 other things. We could have, you know, grown new hair or something like that, but we don't. We start producing salt water. You'd be surprised at how deep that question is and how difficult the answer. I don't think we even have a full answer yet, but it will take them deep inside evolution, psychology, etc., etc. And they love messing around with all of that. So these are examples of big questions. And if we can change a GCSE style exam into one that asks just a few of those big questions and says, you don't, I mean, there is no right answer, but I want to see what you think. If we can then develop teachers who are able to evaluate such answers, instead of saying this is right and this is wrong, we would have a much more meaningful examination. Something that will tell us something about our children really, instead of saying you got 32 out of 100 in whatever. So I'm going to make these 3 suggestions. And the system everywhere is really almost ready to take it. Not because of me, but because of the fact that they think that it is inevitable that this has to happen. Why? And that's the last bit of what I had to say, is when I first heard people sort of arguing or calling my suggestion, the third one about using the internet during exams, calling it absurd, I used to feel kind of sorry for myself, since nobody is believing me, or nobody is taking this seriously. Until I realized that I need not feel sorry about it. I'll tell you why. About 3 years ago, there was a newspaper report from India which said, Army deployed to search children for mobile phones before exams, because there were 30 million children appearing for the equivalent of GCSE. The army, the Indian army, was searching them for smartphones. About 2 years ago, these are real reports, about 2 years ago, a newspaper report said, this year the government has announced that in addition to not having smartphones, children should not be allowed to carry smartwatches into the examination. And last year came the one that I found quite hilarious. In addition to smartphones and smartwatches, children's ears will be examined for Bluetooth earbuds, with which they may be in communication with the internet. So I was joking about it in a meeting in America and saying, you know, if we let this go on, in another year's time, the government's going to take a decision that every child should be put through an MRI body scanner. Well, I went to Argentina a few weeks ago, and they said, Sugata, do you know what they've done this year? They're scanning the children. Okay? So I thought, well, this is it. It's obvious that the internet is anyway going to come into the exam and come into anything. This is the world that your 10-year-old is definitely going to see, your 5-year-old is going to live inside it. What is that world? It's a strange world. It's where you cannot tell by looking at a person like me whether it is I who is speaking or whether, using some means, I'm reading off somebody else's website. You will have no way to tell. When you do that, it's the end of knowing. Because what does knowing mean in that word then? You could either feel sorry about it, or you could say that Homo sapiens, monkeys, took only 10,000 years of civilized life to change from a single brain into a collective hive mind of 3 billion brains, and to make knowing obsolete. Well, if you think about it. So thanks, that's where I am.